Let's start from Sudan, where hundreds are killed and more are wounded in the fighting since April. What are the two rivalries fighting for?
On the one hand, you have the Sudan Armed Forces, which is the regular army of Sudan, which has governed Sudan for most of the period since independence. And on the other side, you have the Rapid Support Forces, which is a paramilitary unit that was created under the long-standing authoritarian regime of Omar al-Bashir, and which the then president al-Bashir had increasingly empowered and increasingly given them money and weapons and ever greater authority. And essentially, this is a fight between those two state security organs about who is the most important, who's the dominant one.
Does China favor on one of the side?
Not to the best of my understanding. I mean, China certainly hasn't made any public pronouncements on this side or that side. However, based on China's, and particularly the People's Liberation Army, long-standing institutional ties with the Sudan Armed Forces, with the regular army, I would be very surprised if behind the scenes, so to speak, China wasn't hoping, as I think many countries are, that the regular army would win and that somehow a degree of stability can return to Sudan. If for whatever reason the Rapid Support Forces would win, that really would be quite extraordinary, because as I said, it would essentially be the official army of a country that would be defeated, overturned, and there's big worries that this would lead to a wider civil war, which may potentially also damage the economic interest of a range of foreign countries, including, of course, China, and that would probably not be very welcome news.
Is this country a major partner for China? What are the main interests that China have in Sudan?
Well, it's still a significant partner, but it's not as important as it used to be. In the 1990s and the early 2000s, as China's engagement with Africa was really beginning to scale up, Sudan was really a very important test case. Sudan was one of the first countries in which Chinese businessmen and Chinese technical experts and Chinese government officials made a number of very important deals important for Sudan as well as important for China. And that, whereas, as I said, some kind of test case that was then taken to other countries in Africa because it had been seen as so successful. And there are two things I think in particular that should be highlighted here. One was the construction of an oil pipeline. So Sudan had long had oil reserves, but had not been able to export any of this oil wealth to international markets. And it was the ability of Chinese engineers to build this pipeline, even in the middle of a civil war, by partnering with the Sudanese government, that led them to be very successful. Now, this was at the same time also very controversial, because there were large human rights violations associated with the construction of the pipeline. But this was very significant, and for a number of years, it made Sudan one of China's most important oil partners in Africa. The second important thing that China did and pioneered in Sudan was the construction of one of the biggest hydroelectric dams in Africa. This was in Sudan known as the Merowe Dam. And to this day, if I'm not mistaken, it remains the single biggest hydroelectric project that China has ever completed in Africa. So it gives you an idea of the kind of interactions that were there. There's been less of that in recent years, in part because Sudan has gone through a very deep economic crisis, and so simply does not have the resources anymore to partner on such big projects. But it used to be very, very significant to China.
When the war is going on, would the oil export to China remain stable?
Oil exports mostly these days come from South Sudan. So what happened since the construction of the pipeline is that part of Sudan separated and became its own country called South Sudan, but is still using the same pipeline, which goes through Sudan, the country it's separated from, to the Red Sea, and from there to international markets. Now, there is indeed a fear that the violence may affect oil infrastructure, and in that sense may hurt both South Sudan, because they would lose their ability to sell their oil in international markets, but also Sudan, because Sudan at the moment is charging a transit fee. So every time oil goes through the pipeline, there's a small fee that has to be paid. That would not be welcome if it were not to happen, but it's at the moment a small fraction of the total, so it wouldn't really affect I guess energy security in China or in other Asian states. For that, the amount has now become too small to be very significant, but it would have a major effect on the African side of things.
Is there a chance that China could help brokering a ceasefire deal?
Yeah, it could. I think if China were to closely coordinate with a number of important regional players, I'm thinking here of the African Union, I'm also thinking of some of Sudan's neighbors, Ethiopia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and China were to use its kind of backdoor channels that it does have to the belligerents, I think that would be incredibly useful. China no longer has the influence, as I said, it had maybe 15 years ago when the economic relationship was more significant, but I think it's still listened to. And as I said, especially if it's in coordination with others.
What about the role the US play in this crisis? Are there major interests for the US in Sudan and South Sudan?
There's not really major economic interests at this moment in time, but Sudan does matter politically. I mean, it's a very strategic location bordering the Red Sea, close to Saudi Arabia, but also Ethiopia and Egypt. A lot of the Nile flows through Sudan, and of course the Nile has been long geopolitically contested over who gets to use the water and who gets to build certain types of infrastructure on the river. And Sudan has at times become a domestic issue inside the United States, particularly at the time of a lot of the violence in the Darfur region, the western part of Sudan. There were important constituencies in the United States, especially young people, who cared a lot and wanted to see action from presidential candidates or congressional candidates or candidates for the Senate in terms of how they would try to stop human rights violations and killing in Sudan. So it has some domestic resonance.
Is there an intense strategic competition between the US and China in this area?
Thankfully not. I mean, actually, I would say Sudan is a good example of a place where actually Chinese and American interests, at least at the local and regional level, are more alike than they are different. And this is important because indeed there is such a global discourse about strategic rivalry, great power competition, a tendency to see everything that China wins is bad for the West, or everything that the United States gets is bad for China. I think from where I'm sitting actually shows that there is a lot to be gained from the United States, China, European partners, regional actors coming together and actually saying, look, you may have your government system, we have ours, but it is in nobody's interest to see this region torn apart, huge humanitarian crisis, economic infrastructure damaged, refugee flows. I mean, we see many countries in Africa that are authoritarian that still have good ties with the West, and we see a number of countries where there's regular democratic elections in Africa that have close relations with China. So this is not a simple free world versus the communist bloc kind of equation as sometimes people make it out to be. It's more complicated, and that's in part because, as I said, African governments are looking for opportunities, regardless of their ideological or political nature.